No one in Japan has even heard of baby metal or BAND-MAID or especially bands like Lovebites. I mean, no one knows who they are. Well, this is a comment that I have seen in various versions coming up on my videos for quite a while. But actually, I think it's a very interesting comment that both has a certain degree of truth to it, but also a certain rather oversimplification to it. And today I really wanted to get into talking about this whole subject of, are these bands, well, are they popular? Are they famous in Japan? And what does that statement even mean when we keep on seeing it in the comments below videos? People saying, yeah, but really, bands like BABYMETAL, no one's heard of them in Japan. So I'm going to try and address this because like I said, I've been thinking about this for years. I've been hearing about this for years. And yes, I am in Japan. So I see the disparity between a lot of the things that overseas viewers really respond to me putting out videos about, you know, like when I do a BABYMETAL reaction or when I do a BAND-MAID reaction compared to if I do a reaction to a band like Shishamo, who are, you know, much bigger in sort of numbers than anyone like BAND-MAID, but I put out a video about Shishamo and I probably get like 50 views on it. So I am very aware of that disparity, but I kind of wanted to address it and see if we can find an interesting and useful way of talking about it. And I've got my notes in front of me and I'm going to try and dive into this subject with all the various ways I've thought about it over the years. Now, the first thing to say is obviously there is the degree of truth for this. And the best way of looking at that is because what basically people are describing is when you see bands like BAND-MAID and BABYMETAL, what you're really seeing is you're just seeing Japan through a window. And you're seeing what of Japan is presented to the outside world. And obviously the things that are going to be most visible, the things that are going to be most promoted as well by, say, YouTube channels for overseas people to watch are going to be the things that are quite different, quite unexpected. You know, bands like BABYMETAL, bands like BAND-MAID, because not only is there a visual aspect to them, which, you know, draws you in before you've even heard the music, but I've said this before, you take these two bands, BABYMETAL and BAND-MAID, even without the picture, if you had no context, you were just a music fan and someone said, hey, there's this band called BABYMETAL, or there's this band called BAND-MAID, M-A-I-D, you'd probably just be thinking, well, I got to hear that just to know what that is. And this is kind of the fair point, is that these bands absolutely do have a hook, which is going to make them much more appealing for being shown to an overseas audience. But it is also true to say that these bands have actually grabbed the overseas audience. The audience have taken them on, not just because of this hook of them being so kind of quirky and different in a sort of visual or a marketing sense, but also because they've delivered a music which is quintessentially very interesting. So, you know, they're giving overseas viewers something to latch on to, but also then backing it up with good quality music. And of course, people in Japan like good quality music as well. It's not like they're going to turn their back on these bands if they're delivering good quality music, but you could argue that they don't, you know, if you're in Japan, you've already got a lot of domestic bands who maybe don't have anything like that to their side. I mean, talking again of bands like Shishamo, much bigger in every single metric than a band like BAND-MAID, but you know, again, they're just not going to have that crossover appeal to play to overseas audiences. And of course, the other aspect as well is that a lot of the overseas audiences who are looking for music online, looking for things that they haven't seen before, it's going to be people who slew slightly towards the heavier side. So, you know, a lot of the fans of you know, musicianship and good quality music in the contemporary Western scene are going to be more metal focused because, let's face it, if you're into pop music, still in the West, given how dire Western pop music as a general is, you're probably not big after looking for nuanced and complex music. So it's mostly like Western metal fans and hard rock fans, thus again slewing the sort of music that they see from Japan as being the harder bands, like BAND-MAID, like BABYMETAL, and like Lovebites. And so this does obviously give us a fair point in saying that, okay, so the things that are being seen due to supply and demand reasons, the things that are more visible, the things that are taken on and are actually sort of really indulged in by overseas fans are going to be things that are not going to be representative of your average normal, you know, view of what is actually popular in Japan right now. So there is a large degree of truth to that when we say that these bands, they look much popular to an overseas audience than they actually are in Japan. Okay, that's true. But then we come on to a different issue because these bands, it's not like they're completely unheard of. See, yes, I do understand that when you look at a band like Love Bites, it was rather interesting that a few people mentioned that they played, I think it was the New Cross Inn when they went to London, basically a pub stage. If you don't know what a pub is, I think pub's a universal term, even in America. Basically like a very small local bar in London. That's where they played. And when I was finding this picture to do this video, interestingly, I got it from the Love Bites website, and the first thing you see on the Love Bites website is that in less than a year, they're playing the Budokan, which is a massive, famous... I mean, if you don't know the Budokan, well, I'd be very surprised. It's one of the most famous venues in the world, certainly in Japan. And that's where they are going to be playing in less than a year. And yet, less than a year ago, they were playing in the tiny New Cross Inn in London. Yes, now, admittedly, it was overflowing of people, but still... They booked that because that's what they felt was appropriate in size for them as a band. So it is worth saying that these bands, they do still have a very big following in Japan, quite a bit bigger than you might actually expect a lot of the time. But then we have to ask the question, well, how do we measure this? What actual level of fame can we say a band has where you can actually go, yeah, in Japan, people would have heard of them. This is sort of band where you speak to your average Japanese person, they would have heard of them. Well, this is where the obvious level of complexity comes in, which just makes this whole thing very hard to discuss. And this is why I'm going to come through to a much more simple conclusion at the end. Because obviously when you're thinking about how to measure it, you have to think, well, first of all, what does it mean to be a household name? Does that mean everyone's heard of you? Because there's plenty of people who everyone's heard of, but you wouldn't know their music. They might just be a celebrity for some other reason. Maybe they got some controversy in the news. I mean, if you ask people on the street, how many people are going to need to say, yes, I know that band, for you to say, oh, they are actually famous? Do you want like every person to say, yes, I've heard of BABYMETAL? Do you want 1 in 2 people? Is 1 in 10 enough? What people are you asking? Are you asking in the city, in the countryside? Are you asking old people? Are you asking young people? We could ask, where do you ask? Do they actually know the music? As I've said, there's like a whole bunch of things that make it very complicated to realistically play out this scenario that's usually set out in these comments of, hey, if you just asked people on the street, they wouldn't know who BABYMETAL are. So I kind of find that is a very hard thing to really measure. It's an easy thing to describe. Hey, if you just ask someone on the street, they wouldn't know what BABYMETAL is. But it's a really hard thing to actually put into a realistic scenario. Now, the other thing, therefore, to take into consideration is the fact that the idea of being a household name or everyone having heard of you, well, there's something both distinctly un-Japanese about that, but also something that doesn't make sense here in 2025. And if I explain the reason why, it's because, well, first of all, Japan is a country of niches. It always has been. This is not to say there aren't household names. There are certain groups who, yeah, pretty much everyone's heard of, but Japan has a lot of healthy niches. We've said this so many times before. The reason why there's so many artists coming out of Japan is when you think about, I come from the UK. UK is famous for music. But if you're an upcoming band, even in the capital city of London, it's pretty hard to find a venue to perform in. Yeah, okay, there's quite a few, but there's more bands than venues. There's not as big an audience. It's just not the same scene. Whereas you go to a place like Japan and there's a healthy music scene for anything. Even if you're into ska music, there's a healthy underground scene with ska nights every single night at multiple venues. Jazz, metal, punk, rap, you name it. Freaking EDM, obviously, there's always somewhere for EDM, but there is idol music, something that pretty much only exists in Japan, Asia as a general, but there is a healthy scene for all of these things, and that is a big part of it, in that a lot of the time, these bands necessarily are kind of more focusing on being famous to their community. Everything they do in their publicity, in all of their focus, it's not about getting out into like some national press outlet. It's not about being on TV. Yes, we do talk sometimes about Japanese artists, doing like maybe some famous TV program. But one of the examples that comes up is, you might be aware that at New Year's Eve in Japan, there's a TV program and it's quite famous. A lot of bands will come on there and people will perform. But as has been pointed out, a lot of the bands who perform on there, they're kind of just like legacy groups. They're not really what people are listening to now. There might be 1 or 2 exceptions. And that's the thing, is that most of these artists are not really focusing on being nationally famous. it's all about ruling the roost in your particular niche, because that's where the fans are active. That's where there's something to be profited from. You know, there isn't a huge amount of profit of just people having heard of you, because that doesn't, you know, people aren't going to pay for you just because they've heard of your name. Whereas, you know, if you are ruling the roost in your genre, then people are going to support that. And that, of course, brings us back round to things like BABYMETAL and, of course, like BAND-MAID. And the question of, well, are they famous in their genres, in their spaces? Well, for this, I'm going to try and basically look at how would we measure that? How would we actually find out if these bands are popular, how popular they are? Well, the most obvious way is to focus on social media. Because when you think about sales, I mean, sales is always a bit of a deceptive thing anyway, isn't it? If you look at social media, that's how many people are, you know, like streaming services, that's how many people are actually responding to your music, or actually consuming your music and all that kind of thing. Now, the most difficult one to measure is obviously going to YouTube, because YouTube in itself, that's not really so much about the music, that's about you like watching the videos. But I am going to briefly touch on YouTube. What I want to start with though is Spotify, and Spotify figures are always an interesting one. Now, yeah, there's other streaming services as well, like there's the Apple one, but I tend to use Spotify because it's one that everyone has access to, and it's very popular in Japan as well. You look at BAND-MAID have 356,000 monthly listeners. Okay, so you say that's a pretty good figure. Interesting enough, legendary band Scandal have almost the same number, just a little bit more. So are Scandal as famous as BAND-MAID? Well, it's an interesting question, because Scandal are more of a legacy band. If you were to go to, as mentioned, like BAND-MAID's YouTube channel, you have a look at it. Their most recent video came out a month ago, 1.6 million views. Zen, 1.7 million views 3 months ago. These, obviously, this one, show them, was a collaboration, but you skip over to Protect You, 1.5 million views. You look at Scandal's YouTube channel, and their most recent videos, 148,000. That was a teaser, 200, you know, 250,000 there. These are much, much lower figures. So when you look at the Spotify figures, what you're really seeing is how many people are listening to their music altogether, because, you know, Scandal have a much longer legacy of music. So does that mean that BAND-MAID are more famous because at the current moment they're more relevant in the scene? Or is Scandal more famous because of the fact that they've been around long enough that more people are likely to have heard of them and maybe know some old tracks and have some sort of fondness for them? Well, I mean, you can look at that in many different ways, and I'm not going to say there's necessarily an answer, but one thing that might be interesting as a little bit of a counter to all of this is we mentioned about those views for BAND-MAID getting, you know, sort of easily 1.5 million on most of their videos, and Scandal, you know, getting more around this sort of 250,000 area. If we look at Lovebites, who, you know, we talked about earlier, let's have a look at some of their music videos. So we've got things like Soul Defender, that got 250,000. You've got things like Unchained, you know, 500,000. So it would be safe to say, in a way, that Lovebites are kind of doing at least the same figures as Scandal. But if you look at Scandal, once again, 379,000 monthly listeners, Lovebites have less than 1/10 of that at 31,000. So again, what is fame? Who will have heard of them? Will it be someone who's been into music for, you know, 20 years? I mean, I've heard of Scandal because I've been working with Japanese music for about 20 years. But then if you've got someone like, I mentioned the band Caramel Candid, who I obviously do so much stuff with, I remember asking them once about Scandal, and they couldn't remember, you know, I think 2 of the members didn't know who they were, and the other 2 were like, are they still together? There was just a general sense of they didn't know them so well. So the question of what is famous is an intriguing one. I mean, again, going back to, we were looking earlier at you know, bands like BABYMETAL. It's fair to say that BABYMETAL obviously had a massive cultural impact at the time, but they've been around for a good 10 years. Now, good thing is, you know, bands tend not to just disappear off the face of the earth in Japan so much, but obviously they haven't got quite the same cultural cachet of being this surprising new thing. They really popularized and defined the kawaii metal scene and the combination of metal and, you know, pop, and you're putting those things together. But since the whole scene has grown up around them, there's new artists who are doing the same thing. We've got artists like Hanabiya and such like, who are probably arguably, you know, doing better numbers right now, or at least, you know, doing similar numbers. And so, you know, the whole issue of, has anyone heard of these things? It's all kind of hard to measure. So basically, the end conclusion we have to come to a conclusion at some point. How do we measure this? How do we really define what is popular? What is something that is doing well in Japan? Because we know how well these artists are doing overseas. We can see it very easily. And the truth is that I would actually go back to that earlier thing that I showed with Love Bites, which is, dare I say it, how many people turn up to your show? Now, this is obviously a little bit of a skewed one as well, because, when you think about shows, not everyone's going to be able to make it to your show, but especially when we're talking about how popular is the artist in Japan. Well, Japan is not an impossibly, insurmountably large distance to cross, especially when you've got things like Shinkansens and in domestic flights. It's very easy to get around. So if you want to see your favorite artist, you'll be able to get to them. And of course, most of these artists do tour around Japan anyway. So how often are they selling out big venues? Well, when you come to a band like BABYMETAL, they don't perform as much. They tour around a lot, but they sell out pretty big venues. I was there at Foxfest. It was pretty huge. Are they the biggest? No. Would they sell out Tokyo Dome these days? I don't know. I'd love to know what you think in the comments. I'm not 100% sure whether they would fill Tokyo Dome these days. But still, they could fill a damn big arena. I'm pretty sure of that. We have BAND-MAID. BAND-MAID filled out Yokohama Arena. Yeah, there were some spaces, but I think it was actually a good choice of venue. They got it like a good... I mean, to me, it was only people up in the rafters who we couldn't see in there. So I would say it was a good 90% full, it felt. But either way, they pretty much filled up that massive venue, which to me suggests, yeah, they are pretty popular. Was there a lot of people there from overseas? Yes. But still, and you've got Love Bites. Love Bites, as we say, are going to be playing at the Budokan. Now, of course, one show does not a fame make. You need to be able to play several shows and you kind of show it's a sustainable thing. But still, I think the best way of judging how popular these bands really are is just to look at, well, how many people are paying for tickets to come along to their shows? As I mentioned, I think merch sales and CDs can be difficult, especially because these days, even in Japan, where the CD market is pretty healthy, I think most people who buy CDs, they buy it to have the copy, but not actively to listen to it. It's ultimately it's a music medium, and most people in Japan who are listening to music are doing it through streaming. That's just the way it is. You ask most people actually nowadays about CDs, and I know plenty of people who buy CDs who don't even have a CD player or a CD drive in their computer. They just buy CDs because, well, it's the CD. I want to own the CD. Maybe one day I want to listen to the CD. That's a pretty common thing here in Japan. I've come across quite a lot as well. So, this is probably, CD purchases is not a good way of judging fame, but I think just the number of people who turn up to your gigs, that's the nearest thing you're going to get to an actual judgment on this, I would say. But ultimately, when it comes down to it, what is the relevant takeaway from this? What is the relevant conclusion? Are these bands just unknown in Japan? Well, first of all, I'd say kind of no. I would say that BAND-MAID, yeah, if you stood on the street and you just asked random people, have you heard of BAND-MAID? I think you could be there for a very long time. I really do. I would say, I don't know, but I would say depending on who you ask, as we mentioned, there's so many factors behind this, you could be there for a very long time. If you asked, have you heard of BABYMETAL? I don't think you'd be there very long. I really don't. I think maybe 1 in 10, depending on where you are and who you're asking. I mean, if you're hanging around an area like Shimokitazawa, you probably find the very first person you come into is going to know. In fact, everyone's going to know. If you go to Shibuya, probably quite a few. If you go to a quiet area, less. If you go to the towns and the villages, it might be 1 in 20. I don't know, but I still think that you're going to find plenty of people who've heard of them. Does that mean they know their music? Does that mean they like their music? Very hard to tell. But BABYMETAL are one of those names where people are going to at least remember the name and they're going to know the picture and go, oh yeah, I remember BABYMETAL, that was a thing. Or maybe they're still into them, who knows. If you ask people, have they heard of Love Bites? Yes, I would suspect probably you find very few. But there's a reason actually why I brought up these 3 bands. Now, the funny thing is, if you were to check all of these on their Spotify monthly plays, which like I said is probably the best sort of statistic I can think of, here's the thing. BABYMETAL have 3.8 million monthly listeners. BAND-MAID have 356,000. And Love Bites have about 31,000. Which means in actual terms of listeners, if we were to use that as a basic metric, Love Bites have a 10th of BAND-MAID and BAND-MAID have about a 10th of BABYMETAL. Which means BABYMETAL are about 100 times as listened to as Love Bites. And yet, I would say if I were to put out a video tomorrow, if I was just to start a channel with no subscribers and put out one video reacting to a BABYMETAL song and one video reacting to a Love Bites song, I think I'd get about the same number of views, honestly. Because the online fan bases are from overseas are surprisingly similar in the responses that I get. You know, just looking at the statistics I get on my channel, they're pretty similar. They're pretty equal. And BAND-MAID pretty equal as well. So the biggest conclusion I can really come to from this is that no, I don't think that these bands are entirely unheard of, but yeah, there is definitely a degree of distortion when you can have three bands who are, well, powers of difference in popularity from each other and when it comes to monthly listeners, and yet would all get very similar view counts if you did a English language video talking about them. So that really is the conclusion to take away. What really is famous enough for you is going to be a very difficult question. Is fame and household fame really a thing anymore when we look at a world where there's more and more niches? And I didn't even mention about the fact that obviously with social media, more and more of us, you know, there's not like universal entertainment so much. It's not like if you go back to the 90s where everyone was kind of listening to the same stuff most of the time. It's like these days, you know, with the social media and you can get into your own circles and your own thing online, everyone is kind of very much in their own world and we're not seeing what everyone else is seeing. You know, we're seeing very different things from our neighbors, from our friends. So I think the general idea of being a household name is a much harder thing to achieve, and I think it's more achieved off of generic fame and just being in the sense of in the media than necessarily being the person who everyone's music is most popular. And yeah, I think that there is a truth to the fact that the overseas lens on Japanese music does maybe equal out the bands who have just succeeded in gathering that online overseas audience. I think once you've gathered that online overseas audience, most bands end up in a very similar place, which is why, like I say, if I did a video about BAND-MAID, BABYMETAL, Love Bites, all three of those videos would get very similar views. Yeah, so I think once you're appealing to that online audience, you're getting very similar numbers. But in Japan, they will be very different. But that's not to say that these bands are not popular or famous in their own right. And what even is fame anyway? There you go. Those are some musings. I tried to get a lot of points into quite a short time there, and yet I still ranted for 22 minutes and 22 seconds at this point. So I hope this was interesting. I raised a lot more points than I think I necessarily concluded, because as I said with this, and as I say with a lot of these off-the-cuff videos, I think sometimes the most interesting thing is expanding and looking at all the things that maybe can't be answered and looking to try and understand the nuances and details behind a lot of these questions, rather than necessarily saying that there's a hard and fast answer to any particular things. They're interesting comments, topics to debate. I hope if you have watched this whole video and thought through all the things that I've spoken about, I hope you can add your thoughts below to this as well. Again, it's not so much a conclusion as just my thoughts on a very interesting topic. So looking forward to seeing what you guys say. And until I hopefully do see that in the comments, thank you for listening to my waffle. And for now, ciao, ciao.